Hello and welcome to HoneyBadgerRadio. My name is Alison and I'm with Hannah Wallen. Okay, Hannah, this week we're going to do a very special episode of HBR Talk. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the topic and why you chose it?
Last week we talked about centrism under threat narrative. And the discussion was basically about people who use sort of a middle ground fallacy as an attack on the legitimacy of the men's rights movement and of men's rights activism. In particular, an attack on our criticism of feminism, where feminism has resulted in law and policy that limit or sort of trespass on men's human rights. And so we did a discussion about the fallacies involved and the nature of the attack on the men's rights movement, and we got a lot of butthurt in the comments. It was quite interesting. I have several comments from one guy, and then I also have a couple of other people who are responding as to what centrism isn't. And several people are doing exactly what we described, and then saying centrism isn't like that, while demonstrating that it is, in fact, exactly like that.
Well, I'd hasten to add that during the show, we were very careful to say that not all centrists are like that. We distinguish between those centrists who look at both sides or look at all of the sides or all of the prevailing evidence, come to their own conclusion, and those centrists who simply say that the correct conclusion is that both sides are wrong, they're right, and they don't even have to look at either side. They may not even find a middle position. They just decide on a position that both are wrong without having looked at the evidence, or both are equivalent without having looked at the evidence. And those were the kinds, that was the kind of behavior that we were calling out. And what I find very amusing, I'm just going to read one of these comments about that. And again, we were very careful to distinguish between centrists who actually do look at all of the evidence and come to their own conclusion, and centrists, people who call themselves centrists, who don't actually do that, but instead sort of almost like they hand wave, having looked at both sides, as if almost like centrism is a magical incantation. So I'll call myself a centrist, say both sides are wrong, and I don't even have to look at the evidence. I don't have to actually significantly consider what I'm seeing and whether or not these two sides are actually equivalent. I just dismiss them both.
Yeah.
And
I will say our most avid self-titled centrist critic, who is the one that sort of had the most butt hurt in the comments, at least our most recent avid critic, that is the one that has the most butthurt in the comments. I asked this person in response to a previous comment for specific examples to back his case, and he essentially called me, like twice, called me names for asking for evidence and for giving evidence as to why he is wrong. So this is somebody that actually gets hostile if challenged on his centrist superiority.
So from this whole exchange, something that occurred to me is that sometimes these people who call themselves centrists, who aren't actually engaging in an activity that really is sensible or rational or logical, which is to look at both sides, come to your own conclusion, look at the evidence, come to your own conclusion, determine whether or not both sides are actually equivalent by looking at the evidence. But instead, they call themselves a centrist because a centrist does that. Like, instead of being a centrist who is a centrist because they engage in examining all the evidence and coming to their own conclusion, they call themselves a centrist, say that that's what centrists do, which is, when you're centrists who are rational do that, and then if you call them out for not having done that, they say, no, actually, this is what centrists do, and no matter what I'm actually doing this. So it's like a fireman who says, well, firemen fight fires, therefore when I'm setting a fire, when I'm actually engaging in arson, because I'm a fireman, I'm actually fighting a fire. It's like you take the label You say the label does this, and then when anybody looks at your actions and says, no, you're not actually doing, you're actually setting fires, you're not fighting fires, you're not reducing fire, you're pouring water on it, you're not putting sand on it, you're not trying to smother the fire, you're actually creating a fire or encouraging it. When people point that out, you say, well, firemen fight fires, therefore I'm fighting a fire. And it's interesting attitude. It applies more than just centrists. It also applies to feminists when they use the equality. Yeah, the feminists will say, we stand for equality. That's what we do. And when you point out, well, you're not creating equality, they'll say, but feminists create equality, so no matter what I'm doing, because I'm a feminist, I'm creating equality. So that was just, this is just like, wow. This is a moment of, I think we've hit on something, Hannah.
Yeah, it's exactly what feminists do.
I think
this is why I like to ask feminist questions. And they say feminism is about equality, and therefore you can't criticize feminism because you're criticizing, a pro-equality movement, and you must be opposing equality if you oppose feminism. And I'll ask, what part of spending 100 years lobbying the government to restrict or limit fathers' custody rights is about equality. Ask them something like that, or ask them, about the feminist history of lobbying against the rights and recourse of male victims of female perpetrators of intimate partner and domestic violence. And as soon as you start asking hard questions like that, then you point out, well, the National Organization for Women, a feminist group, like the biggest feminist group in the United States, is the National Organization for Women. It's not like, just some fringe thing. It's actually the biggest set of card-carrying feminists are members of the National Organization for Women. And that group has spent my entire life lobbying actively against fathers' rights. And other feminists before them did the same thing. They've literally fought tooth and nail. Like they've scratched back against not just equally shared parenting, but before equally shared parenting, just the concept of shared parenting. Before the concept of shared parenting, the concept of joint custody. All of that has been feminist activity. So what part of that is about equality? And of course, they never are able to answer that, ever.
It's fascinating to be able to discover or label or identify and isolate a new strain of human insanity, because this really is insane. When you go out of your way to explain that centrism can be applied in a positive way to any situation, because the positive centrists, rational centrists, look at both sides and say, well, the reality is, based on the evidence that I'm seeing, is maybe this side is correct, maybe that side is correct, maybe neither is correct, maybe both are correct and wrong. Maybe there's a bridge between them. And you say that's what rational centrists do, but then there are these irrational centrists who make these logical errors by equating two sides without really looking at either one and saying, well, because I am a centrist, I am automatically right because both sides are wrong. That process, and then you get somebody saying, well, that's not what centrists do. But we're not saying that centrists do that. We're not saying rational centrists do that. We're saying irrational centrists do that. And irrational people that call themselves centrists in the name of centrism.
Irrational people that call themselves centrists. And in the name of centrism, in the name of centrism, and in the name of being above the fray, as centrists often do pretend to be. And
then they turn around and they say, you are saying that centrists do irrational things. And we're like, no. We say that some people who call themselves centrists are engaging in an irrational way, and they're using centrism as a defense by basically making this strange idea that if you're a centrist, no matter what you're doing, you're always doing something rational. And it's like you're using the identity as a defense instead of getting the identity as a result of your actions. You're taking whatever action you want and hiding behind the identity to excuse it. And it's
a get out of examination free card.
A get out of examination free card.
It is.
And I find this fascinating. I find human beings endlessly fascinating in the ways that they can rationalize stuff. It's just remarkable. All right, so if you want to hear more on this particular conversation, you can go to our streaming channel, Badger Live Streams. It is I never get this right. Just a second. I have to. Yep, right here. And please do continue. We're going to be continuing the conversation. Please do join us. And have a wonderful afternoon, my lovely specimens.